Alright, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching the videos. We are now in section 6.2b. We're going to talk about polynomials. We're going to factor polynomials. Again, chapter 5 talked about taking two binomials and two maybe monomials and just multiplying together those two factors to get a product. Now we're going to go backwards from that and take a product, especially a trinomial of the form of this form here, ax squared plus bx plus c, and find out what the factors are of that. In other words, write out what those factors are that multiply together to get to ax squared plus bx plus c. Alright, so that said, let's go to the smartboard, and we're going to say, you know what, we've done this already. Here's where we're at. We're factoring trinomials, and let's, again, for this situation, for only section 6.2, our a is equal to 1. So let's keep that in mind. We're going to, and here are the rules. For a is equal to 1, we're going to modify these rules in section 6.3 and 6.4 when a is not equal to 1, but we're going to find out what to do. So again, here's our rules to make our life easier. Here's 1 and 2 and 3, and again, I apologize for that. I couldn't modify this in my smartboard presentation and still keep my 1, 2, and 3s. It turned into bullet points, so without too much work, we're just going to modify it here. So step number 1 is write the trinomial in descending order. Remember, descending order talks about the exponents on the variables. So 2, 1, 0, so this term should come first. Step number 2, to make our life easier, is factor out any factor that's common to all the terms. Later on, we'll find that maybe there's, all these terms have a common number of, 10. We can factor out the 10 to make factoring the smaller numbers a lot easier. Step number 3, to make, again, our life easier, is to factor out a -1 if that term is negative. And after we do that, then we follow step 4, 5, and 6, write the factors, x and then minus or plus something, x minus or plus something. Those are our two factors right here. They're going to multiply together to get our product here. We have to assign our signs. We have to determine what the signs are here and here. If this is a positive number, then these two, this times this, have to multiply together to give me c. So it's either positive times positive gives me a positive, or negative times negative gives me a positive. Again, if c is positive. If c is negative, if that number is negative, then we've got either x plus something times x minus something, or x minus something times x plus something. And really that wouldn't matter. Again, when we get to, I guess, bring that thought up in just a second. When we take a look at the numbers, then we've got to assign the numbers here, and we have to find the pair of the numbers, those kind of magic numbers, where the sum of those two numbers, this number and that number, equals b, that number there, and the product equals c. We did a couple of examples right here. So I'm going to bring up the thought that I had in the previous page. I wrote x minus 5 times x minus 10. We could have just as easily have said it's x minus 10 times x minus 5, because this in red is equivalent to this in black and green. Not a problem. Alright, and sometimes these are going to jump out at you. This was our homework assignment for the previous video. So let's go through some more examples. Let's take a look at these examples here and say, here's, again, x squared minus 5x minus 14. Sometimes it jumps out at you what the factors are. Sometimes it doesn't. If it doesn't, especially when the numbers get larger and larger and when a is not equal to 1, you might want to go through this process. If it jumps out at you that the product of these two numbers is negative 14 and the sum is negative 5, well, shoot, that one might jump out at me as saying, well, this might be x minus 7 times x plus 2, because negative 7 times positive 2 is negative 14, and negative 7 plus 2 is negative 5. So there's our factorization. However, if it doesn't jump out at you, and sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it takes a lot of practice to find out what those two numbers are, what those two magic numbers are, well, you have to go through number 1, what's the product, and number 2, what's the sum. And if we make our life easy as well, following those 1, 2, 3 steps, step number 1 is write the product the product, this trinomial, in descending order. X squared goes first, x to the first power goes next, x to the 0th power goes last, so this is in descending order. Can we factor out any common factors to make our life easy, to make this a smaller polynomial that we'd have to factor out? Nothing jumps out because this is an x squared. There's only x's in here, and there's only numbers in here, so nothing can be factored out to make anything simpler. Step number 3 would be factor out a negative number or a negative 1 from the entire polynomial. If this a, or if this term here, this leading term, is negative, it's not negative. So again, it's been given to us in probably a very easy, straightforward way. We don't have to really modify it to make our life easy. Step number 4 would be to write this down here, x and x. And again, we have our factorization here, and I'm just going to go through how to get here if it doesn't jump out at you. Step number 4 is write these factors down. Step number 4 is determine the signs. Well, let's see. This is a negative number, so negative 14. Negative 14 means that one of these is positive, one is negative, because they have to multiply together to get me a negative number. And for that reason, then you can write a negative sign here and a positive sign there, and then just start factoring. So now step number, let's see, we determined the signs, and here's our steps. We wrote the factors, we determined the signs. Now we have to look for those magic numbers. We've got to find that pair of factors of C that multiply together to give us a product of equal to C and sum equal to B. So here's our magic numbers. We've got to find a pair of factors of negative 14 that add up to negative 5. So we start with, all right, negative 1 and positive 14. And you know what, that doesn't work because the sum would be positive 13. All right, throw that one away. And we'd go through logically that way and say negative 1. Well, the next step would be negative 2. And negative 2 times 7 adds up to positive 5. And this one is where you have to say, all right, well, you really have to pay attention because negative 2 plus 7 gives me a positive 5. Don't be misled to say, oh, there's my answer, because we're looking for a negative 5 here. So throw that one away. 3 is not a factor. 4 is not a factor. 5, 6, and 7. So we could go, if we get to that point where we go to negative 7 times positive 2, we could do that. Negative 7 times positive 2 multiplies together to get me negative 14 and adds up to negative 5. And that one should be our answer, because this negative 5 is that negative 5 right there. So the two pair of numbers, our magic numbers, are negative 7 and positive 2. And there's the negative 7 goes in there, positive 2 goes in there, and that should be our answer. We can double check by saying x minus 7 times x plus 2. What do we get? We have to FOIL, use that darn F word. X squared, first term, is x squared. Outside term is plus 2x. Inside term minus 7x. Last term is minus 14. Negative 7 times 2. And combine the like terms, we get x squared minus 5x minus 14. X squared minus 5x minus 14 checks out. So there is our correct factorization. And we're done. And I did, in fact, get it correct when I jumped ahead and said, oh, I think it's this one. Sometimes, especially with the smaller numbers, it might jump out at you. All right, so that said, let's get just a little more practice. We're going to go through a couple more. So let's go through two more examples here. This one and this one, both of these on this page of Smartboard. Go through these, and I encourage you, in fact, I invite you, in fact, no, wait, I'll tell you, please stop the video, work on these on your own, go through making your life easy, and then go through, factoring. Write down the x and the x, and inside the factors, write down the signs, and then work on the numbers. Sometimes it might jump out at you, sometimes not. If it does jump out at you, you're welcome to just jump ahead and say, it jumps out at me. Here should be my answer. And if it does jump out at you, then you have to make sure that you FOIL to make sure that you've got the correct answer. So pause the video now. Work on these on your own, especially working on making your life easy. And we'll come back. Alright, so now we've got some time here. We've got, these are going to be more challenging ones, because now we have to say, here's my negative 8p minus 48 plus p squared, and I've been given that, and I've been told to factor that. So there's my trinomial, and I have to factor it. All right, well, you know what? I remember those make your life easy ones rules, make your life a lot easier, because if we start doing this and we say, oh, here's my A, here's my B, and here's my C, well, we might get into, in fact, we will get into some really messed up factorization, because if we're looking to get something that, well, shoot, first of all, this, if we're assuming that this is our A, and I'm telling you that it's not, but if we're assuming that this is our A, and this is our B, and this is our C, then we're messed up, because number one, we have to write things in, number one, descending order. Number two, factor out any greatest common factor. Number three, factor out a negative one if there is one present. So let's write down this in descending order. Descending order talks about the exponents that are on each of the variables. So descending order means that p squared comes first, so I'm going to write p squared. And you could say that there's a 1 there, but we don't have to write it. There's a positive sign there. We don't have to write it because there's a positive sign here, but we don't have to write it. So there's p squared. The next term is p to the first power, or just p. So again, the term is negative 8p that we have to write down. The third term is just whatever's left over, negative 48, because again, it's negative 48p to the 0th power. P to the 0th power is 1. They just don't write it. Just don't write it down here. So now we've written things in descending order, and now that changes a lot, because instead of saying our A is 8, which is not correct, we say our A is 1, which is, hey, great, that's the section 6.2 that we're working on. All right, so here's our A is 1, B is negative 8, C is negative 48. Step number 1 is write in ascending order. Step number 2 is factor out any greatest common factors. Well, we can't really factor out any greatest common factors because there's nothing common in any of these terms. Step number 3 is if there's a negative sign here in our leading term, we'd factor out a negative sign. We don't have to do that because there's no negative sign there. So step number 4 is write down our x, or sorry, not our x, because now we're working with the variable p. So write down our p factors and our p factors. Make your own joke there, I guess. I hate the letter P because there's, especially with 7 and 8-year-old kids, there's sometimes some potty jokes going on at our house. All right, so here is our factorization. We're starting with our factors. We have to assign our signs. How do we do that? This C is negative, so that means that one of these is negative, one of these is positive. Doesn't matter in this section. It doesn't matter which is which. So right now we just write down a negative, write down a positive. And now, if it jumps out at you, it jumps out at you. If it doesn't, then we have to say, all right, well, let's write down that our product has to be negative 48. Product. And our sum of those two magic numbers has to be negative 8. And then we start with our product and we say, all right, well, my product of negative 48 has to be negative and positive, and one has to be negative, one has to be positive, because they multiply together to get a negative 48. They add up to negative 8 here, so I'm going to start with the bigger number being negative, because when they add up, they have to be negative 8. So let's start with positive 1 and negative 48, because that gives us, if we add these up, that gives us a negative 47. And we're looking for a negative number here. That's why I'm putting the negative sign over here first. Let's see, 1 and 48 doesn't work. 2 and 24, sorry, negative 24 adds up to negative 22. Sorry, that one doesn't work and that one doesn't work because we're looking to match that sum there. It'd be 3 and negative 16. We're getting closer too, by the way. So we're getting closer to that negative 8, so we're going in the right direction. Negative 3 and positive 16 adds up to negative 13. Not quite 8, to not quite negative 8. 4 and negative 12. 4 times negative 12 gives us negative 48. Add these up. Sorry, negative 13 doesn't work either. 4 and negative 12 adds up to negative 8. And sure enough, there are, I'll write that in red, there are our magic numbers. So the 4 is positive. We put that one right there. Negative 12 goes right there, negative 12. So that should be negative 12. And there's our factorization. That's what we assume our factorization is. Now we can double check. not a lot of room down here, so I'll just go through and double check this and say, if we FOIL it, p times p gives us p squared. Okay, that works out. Inside terms and outside terms, negative 12p plus 4p gives us negative 8p. That works out as well. Last term is negative 12 times positive 4 gives us negative 48. So you know what? There's our correct factorization. All right. Hopefully you've paused and done some of this work as well. If you haven't, pause the video and we'll come back. All right. So for this one, we're going to have to do a couple of things. Remember, step number 1 was 1, 2, and 3 were making our life easy. Number 1 was put it in descending order. So for this one, we've got t cubed and t squared and t to the first power. So we have to write this as 10t cubed, and we're just rewriting this positive 10t cubed. Rewrite this as the next term, negative 30t squared, and then negative 40t or minus 40t. All right, so there we've written a descending order, and now it looks kind of like this, because this is what we should have: 2, 1, 0, and in fact we've got 3, 2, 1 as our exponents. All right, so that means that step number 2, we've got to say factor out any greatest common factor that we've got. For this one, we have to look at each one of these and say it jumps out at me that we could factor out a 10 and a t from each one of these, because this is 10 divided by 10 is 1, 30 divided by 10 gives me 3, 40 divided by 10 gives me 4, and okay, those are all factorable. And there's also a t in each one of these, t cubed, t squared, and t, so we can factor out a 10t, and this is what I recommend, putting the greatest common factor over here, so you can kind of go through and say 10t cubed divided by 10t gives me just 1 t squared. Again, if we're looking at the exponents, it would be t cubed divided by t to the first would be t to the 3 minus t to the 1 is t squared. All right, the next one is negative 30t squared divided by 10t gives me a negative 30 divided by 10 is 3. T squared divided by t is t. And the same thing holds true for here. Negative 40t divided by 10t is negative 4 by itself. And the reason I do it this way is to put the factor out here. So now I can go back and say 10t times t squared is 10t cubed. Okay, good, that's right. 10t times negative 3t gives me negative 30t squared. Okay, that's right. 10t times negative 4 gives me negative 40t, and that's a correct factorization. That's because I've gone back and used the distributive property to double check my work. All right, next step is I'm looking to factor this whole thing. So we've got to keep the 10t there because that's part of the factor. That's one of the factors that comes out. That's one of the greatest common factors, but it's still a factor. So we could write now 10, whoops, hang on a second. Let me write it in blue just to keep it consistent. Here's 10t times, well, let's see. My next question is, do we have to factor out, to make our life easy, we would have to look and see, do we need to factor out a negative 1 from this? We don't need to factor out a negative 1 because it's not there. So now we can just say that now we can start looking at step number 4, 5, and 6. 4 is assign the signs. Actually, sorry, step 4 is write our factors as t and t. And then step number 5 is write down our signs. The signs are determined by, first of all, this sign here. This is negative, so one has to be negative, one has to be positive, and we just go from there. So now we have to say, from this red one, from this red trinomial, we have to start factoring just that, because this greatest common factor has been factored out already, and now we have to just simply rewrite this. And we'll rewrite this as red. And in fact, just to make it clear, I'm going to go over here and say right there, I'm going to erase that, go back and just make it red, because now we're factoring our red trinomial in terms of red factors. And we have to, again, find our magic numbers. Magic numbers have to multiply together to get negative 4, add up to negative 3. This one might just jump out at you. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And for this one, we have to say negative 4. Well, let's see. I'm going to start with a positive 1, because that would give me a negative 4. and the negative 4 has to be bigger than, the magnitude of the negative 4 has to be bigger so that I can get a negative number over here. So that's why I start with a positive here to get me a negative larger number. So there's our two factors. What do they add up to? 1 plus negative 4 is negative 3, and sure enough, there's our magic numbers. We don't have to go too far. So there's our magic numbers. One is positive 1. So that one goes right there. The other one is negative 4. And now we could double check our work. I'm not going to double check multiplying by this, but I'm going to double check all this here. And I'm going to say, well, you know what, t plus 1. If t plus 1 times t minus 4 is equal to this trinomial, then I think we're okay because we kind of double checked our greatest common factor before already. So let's do the FOIL. T squared, first is t squared, t times t. Outside is minus 4t. Inside is plus 1t, or just plus t. Last is minus 4, plus 1 times minus 4. And then combine the like terms, and we get t squared minus 3t minus 4, and that looks like that. In fact, that is that. So again, this factorization is the correct factorization because we double checked our Christmas colors here, our red and green down here, and we double checked this factorization here with 10t up here when we did our distributive factor, our distributive property. So there's our correct factorization. And you do need to include that 10t there because it is part of the factorization of that first trinomial. All right, well, let's see. I'm going to assign you to do this one here for your homework, because we've gone through already two examples of, kind of going through, kind of greatest common factor. This one here, I guess, there's no greatest common factor to pull out, but I will remind you to go through step number 1, 2, and 3, descending order, greatest common factor, and then, oh, by the way, negative 1. So when you do factor out that negative 1, make sure you factor it out correctly as a negative 1 times whatever is left over. And remember my hint of putting the negative 1 factor out here, and then negative a squared divided by negative 1 gives you something. Positive 6a divided by negative 1 gives you something. So make sure you follow that correctly, and that way you get your signs correct. So do that one for homework. Take notes, add it to your notes, and hand it in the Dropbox. Let's go to the last example, and I'm going to say this one is, let's see. Let me ask you what a prime number is. Prime number, or maybe just refresh your memory. Prime number is something that's divisible by only 1 and itself. So let's take a look at something like 6. Is 6 a prime number? Well, no. We've got 2 and 3 could be factors of 6. How about something like 7? Let's see. Well, it's 1. 2 doesn't go in. 3 doesn't go in. 4 doesn't. 5, 6 doesn't go in. So really, the only factorization is 1 and 7. So that means that this is prime. So if you can't factor it other than just 1 and itself, then it's prime. So let's keep that in mind as a prime number and go over here and say, what about this polynomial? Let's try and factor the polynomial and see what we get. All right, step number 1, make our 1, 2, and 3 make our life easy. Factor out, number 1, descending order. 2, 1, 0. Again, look at the exponents on the variables. 2, 1, 0 are in descending order, so step number 1 is done for us. Step number 2, factor out any greatest common factor. No greatest common factor can come out. Step number 3, factor out a negative 1 from here. There's no negative sign here, so step number 1, 2, and 3 are done for us. Step number 4 is put down our kind of factors here, and this would be x, this would be x. And then 5 is determine the sign. This has to be positive, or this is positive, so it's either positive times positive or negative times negative. The negative times negative is the answer because it has to add up to a negative here. So there's a negative, there's a negative. Step number 6 is try and use these numbers to kind of find our magic numbers. So we have to multiply, we have to find a pair of factors of 8 that multiply together to give me 8, positive 8, and add up to negative 13. So let's try and factor something out. And already you might say, wait a second, this might not work. So we go through 8. Positive 8 would be, well, we have to have both negative numbers. So it would be negative 1 times negative 8. Adds up to negative 9. You know what? That doesn't work. Negative 2 times negative 4 adds up to negative 6. We're kind of going the wrong way too, and that kind of gives us a hint as well. Negative 2 and negative 3 doesn't go in. Negative 4 and negative 2, well, you know what? That's the same as that one there. So we just throw that one away because we've already done that work there. So with all the factorizations of 8, 1 times 8, 2 times 4, none of them add up to negative 13. So we can't find in the integer world factors that would go up here and fill in that number and that number. So we have to say that, well, in the integer world, this is a prime polynomial because we can't factor it. All right, that said, there's an example. Next is our homework, so I guess we're done. Congratulations. See you in class. Bring your homework to class. Sorry, bring your questions to class, and make sure you take a picture of your homework, or sorry, your notes, and the example that I asked you to do right back here, and drop it in my Dropbox.